perfection of a being that could guarantee the possibility of the highest good, since attributing goodness to such a being is based on its being responsible for the best possible moral state of affairs, it is not clear that one could establish all of the attributes that would be necessary to identifying that being with the Judeo-Christian God. Take omniscience and omnipotence. To proportion virtue and happiness, such a being might need to know the moral character of every rational agent, but not the state of everything else in the world. So omniscience is not obviously required to bring about the highest good. Similarly, such a being would not have to create everything in the world ex nihilo. Instead, all that such an argument would establish is the necessity of a moral architect who arranges states of happiness in the world according to a certain design. As a result, even if the moral argument were successful in establishing the existence of an actual cause of the proportion of happiness to virtue that is required for the highest good, it would still fall short of its intended conclusion. A proper appreciation of Kant's position in the first critique, however, relieves, I suggest, some of the pressure placed on Kant's moral argument by these objections. Specifically, if theoretical reason requires that we think of God, understood in terms of transcendental and not moral predicates, as the ground of all possibility, then I think both of these objections can be answered. First, Kant would clearly reject the attempt to explain the possibility of the highest good in terms of the possibility of God, as the first objection would have it. For when it comes to ultimate explanations, Kant firmly maintains the priority of actuality over possibility, as he makes clear as early as the new elucidation and the only possible argument, where possibility presupposes actuality. More importantly, however, insofar as Kant has already provided an account of the logical possibility of everything, and thus of that of the highest good as well, what is at issue in the moral argument clearly must be something more robust than accounting for logical possibility. What might that be? Kant claims that when we act, we are necessarily interested in the realization of the end or object of our actions. I mean, that's just a feature he notes about us as human beings. You can imagine beings that didn't have that. He just says, that's not what we're like. So the interest we take in that object presupposes not simply that it must be logically possible, but rather that it is actually attainable or genuinely possible in these circumstances. And here I think that Bob Adams has published a wonderful article in the Journal of Philosophy in 1994 or 5 that really explores this idea more fully, pretty much independently of any context, just as an argument in its own right. And so I think that he's definitely latching on to what Kant's up to here. As a result, when reason demands that we act according to the moral law and assumes that the highest good must be possible as the ultimate end of our moral actions, then reason requires the existence of something that makes this end genuinely attainable for us, given that we do not have complete control over where the ends of our actions are realized. Second, the fact that the moral argument, if successful, establishes only the moral attributes of whatever causes the real possibility of the highest good, need not be viewed as problematic if the moral argument is not intended to prove any non-moral predicate of God in the first place. If we supplement this argument with the conclusion of Kant's argument from the first critique, a more comprehensive case for God's existence emerges. Specifically, if the argument from the first critique that accounts for possibility establishes the existence of a simple, eternal, necessary mind containing the most fundamental properties, such as omnipotence and omniscience, then the practical argument from the second critique simply adds the moral predicates of goodness and justice, such that the predicates that are typically associated with God by philosophers in the Judeo-Christian tradition will have been established. It is striking that in the Pölitz transcripts from his lectures on the philosophical doctrine of religion from 1783, 4, or 85, 86, I'm not quite sure about that, and even if there are lots of problematic features of the details of his specific things that he says, the very structure of it makes a point clear. Since Kant explicitly divides up his treatment of God and the divine attributes in precisely this way. So, after distinguishing rational and empirical theology, which corresponds roughly to our distinction between natural and revealed religion, so yeah, empirical theology, it's an interesting concept, Kant divides rational theology into transcendental, natural, and moral theology. Transcendental theology proceeds independently of all experience, merely from pure understanding and reason. Natural theology compares God with our own natures as physical beings, whereas moral theology considers what can be inferred about God as the highest moral good. In line with this classification, he distinguishes between what he calls transcendental, physical, and moral perfections, which correspond to our conceptions of God as cause, author, and ruler of the world. The entire structure of his lectures is then built on this classificatory framework. He starts with transcendental theology, arguing that it establishes considerably less than is sometimes thought, but still more than nothing, namely a deistic conception of God. It proceeds then to natural theology, which establishes theism, and finally moves on to moral theology, which is devoted to the moral attributes of God. Specifically, Kant is reported to have said, quote, "In transcendental theology, I think of God as having no limitation, but I do become acquainted with God, but do I become acquainted with God at all in this way? Hence, the deist's concept of God is wholly idle and useless and makes no impression on me if I assume it alone. But if transcendental theology is used as a propedeutic or introduction to the other two kinds of theology, it is of great and wholly excellent utility." End quote. Thus, even if it obviously faces significant challenges on a number of fronts, Kant's strategy of establishing belief in the full Judeo-Christian God's existence by means of such a multi-step procedure has obvious advantages over more simplistic attempts that hope to establish such an ambitious conclusion in a single leap. However, what I most want to draw attention to about Kant's moral argument is not any of the particular details of any particular steps, but rather it's the fact that although it is obviously practical in its basic orientation, it is in its fundamentals very much like the critical theoretical argument from possibility. In both cases, no objective evidence in favor of God's existence is adduced. Instead, reason, based on its most fundamental and essential needs, has to make this kind of metaphysical assumption. Viewed from this perspective, the moral argument asserts that certain metaphysical claims are presupposed as conditions, not on the possibility of experience or theoretical cognition, but rather on our adherence to the demands of morality and the possibility of freedom, which Kant refers to at the beginning of the second critique as the keystone to his entire critical philosophy. In other words, I like summing things up at the end of sections, the moral order, which is undoubtedly essentially subjective in a certain sense, due to the notion of autonomy that underlies it, the moral order is possible only if one is rationally committed to a metaphysical and, in fact, a divine order as well. So, third part, mechanical and teleological laws. The third topic that I want to focus on very briefly is Kant's interpretation of the relationship between mechanical and teleological laws. While there's a fascinating history to this topic, both in early modern thinkers and in Kant's own pre-critical works, especially The Only Possible Argument, let me focus here exclusively on his treatment of these issues in the third critique, which represents his most considered view on the topic. In the second half of the third critique, Kant turns his attention from aesthetics to organisms, and after providing an analysis of objective purposiveness, showing that organisms are natural ends, he argues that an antinomy of judgment arises from our experience of organisms, which display a distinctive kind of causality that seems to defy mechanical explanation. Though Kant presents, somewhat confusingly, two sets of contradictory principles, one constitutive and the other regulative, a genuine antinomy arises only for the regulative pair. According to the regulative thesis, all generation of material things must be judged as possible according to mechanical laws alone, whereas according to the regulative antithesis, some material things cannot be judged as possible according to merely mechanical laws, since judging them requires an entirely different law of causality, namely that of final causes and teleological laws. In short, the contradiction arises when we experience organisms because although we are supposed to explain everything through mechanical principles alone, organisms, given their unique causal structure, defy mechanical explanation and call for explanations in terms of teleological laws instead. It is important to note that these principles, despite their regulative status, are truly contradictory. For example, they are not simply recommending that one look for either mechanical or teleological laws to explain things in nature. After all, there's no contradiction in explanatory multitasking by being open to a range of explanations of any given phenomenon. Instead, these judgments are genuinely contradictory insofar as the one asserts that mechanical laws all by themselves can be used to judge the possibility of the generation of natural things, while the other claims that mechanical laws alone cannot be used to make such judgments. Whatever our judgment about what makes the generation of natural things possible, it must involve either mechanical laws alone or laws other than mechanical ones as well. Accordingly, if one sought explanations that involved both mechanical and teleological laws at the same time, one would be performing activities that contradicted the thesis, insofar as one would be looking for explanations that were not restricted to mechanical laws alone. So it's clear that the thesis and antithesis are in fact contradictory on strictly philosophical grounds. There were decades of misunderstanding of this kind of point because people thought the regulative ones aren't contradictory, therefore it must be the constitutive principles, for which he has no arguments. So how could it be an antinomy with no arguments? At any rate, skipping over that. Now, at first glance, Kant's solution to the antinomy raises as many puzzles as it solves. Kant begins by noting that the thesis concerning the necessity of mechanistic explanation is one that derives from the discursive nature of our understanding. For beings such as ourselves, who obtain cognition by applying concepts to objects given through the senses, the parts necessarily precede the whole. As a result, we cannot have cognition of organisms as such, since the reciprocal causal connection between the parts and the whole involved in organisms affords a priority to the whole that is incompatible with our discursive understanding. So, first puzzle is, does this not entail the outright falsity of the antithesis? Looks like it does. He then suggests that the antinomy can be resolved if one appeals to a supersensible ground that somehow underlies both mechanistic and teleological laws, though he concedes that we cannot have objective cognition of such a supersensible ground. Well, puzzle 2. How can positing something unknowable help to avoid a contradiction between the thesis and antithesis? If all contradictions could be resolved that easily, just posit something you don't know anything about. And that'd be a wonderful solution to every contradiction. But I think we find that a little bit unsettling, unsatisfactory. And he seems to conclude his resolution by saying that the supersensible ground allows one to subordinate mechanistic explanations to teleological explanations. Well, puzzle 3. I did note that there were going to be puzzles here, right? Puzzle 3. Why should positing a supersensible entity lead one to prioritize teleology over mechanism, rather than vice versa? It's no wonder that the initial excitement that accompanied Kant's interest in organisms in the Third Critique has never been matched by a deep and lasting satisfaction with the position that he seems to end up adopting. If, however, we keep in mind what Kant takes himself to have established in the first and second critiques, a more optimistic perspective, I guess San Diego does make you optimistic, and sunny and optimistic here. So, a more optimistic perspective on Kant's resolution of the antinomy emerges. For if we recall that reason requires that we think of God as the ground of possibility, and note that the thesis and antithesis are about the possibility of things, both animate and inanimate, what otherwise seems extremely puzzling can be rendered somewhat more intelligible.